Hello, everyone. My name is Bill Coughlin, and welcome to First Person Civil War Podcast, which retells the stories of the soldiers and officers on the ground, and for this episode, on the water, in the battles of the Civil War. Episode 38 is entitled Major Joseph L. Brent and the Expedition to Capture the USS Indianola, and relies on a book he published in 1926, which combined two unrelated topics, the Lugo case and the capture of the ironclad Indianola. Joseph L. Brent was born in Maryland in 1826 and traveled to California in 1850, where he described Los Angeles as a city of about 2,500 inhabitants, including the population in the gardens and vineyards clustering along the river bottoms. By his estimate, only 75 inhabitants were American citizens, while the rest he described as native Californians. But it is assumed he meant the Tongva Nation. In the first part of his book, entitled The Lugo Case, Joseph L. Brent recounts some of his time as a prominent lawyer in Los Angeles. But he also became active in politics as a member of the California State Assembly. After the start of the Civil War, Joseph L. Brent sided with the Confederacy and traveled back east. His method of return was by way of Panama, then by boat to New York City. Upon his arrival, he was arrested for treason, but the charges were eventually dropped, and he was released. By April of 1862, he managed to cross into Virginia and was responsible for the Ordnance Department of Major General John B. Magruder's Army of the Peninsula, but at that time he held no rank in the Confederate Army. That same month, Major General Magruder requested Joseph L. Brent an officer's commission, and in May he received the rank of major in the Confederate Army. Following the Peninsula Campaign, Major Brent received orders to serve as the Chief of Ordnance and Artillery to Major General Richard Taylor, commander of the Western Louisiana District of the Department of the Trans-Mississippi, to which he reported by September of 1862 to Alexandria, Louisiana. In February of 1863, the USS Queen of the West, which was a side-wheel steamer ram ship, ran the Vicksburg batteries, meaning from a point north of the city, it successfully sailed down the Mississippi River and made it past the Confederate batteries that guarded the bluffs of Vicksburg, without suffering heavy damage. The Queen of the West proceeded to engage Confederate ships at will on the various rivers south of Vicksburg. It then sailed up the Red River, intent on attacking the Confederates at Fort DeRussy, but failed in its attempt, and the ship was ultimately captured on 14 February 1863. The Queen of the West sailed further upriver to Alexandria, and once it arrived there, Major General Taylor ordered Major Brent to assess the ship for future service for the Confederacy and coordinate needed repairs. Once Major Brent reported that the ship was serviceable, there was little time wasted for the now CSS Queen of the West to be pressed into service, as reports of more Union ironclads had run the batteries of Vicksburg, and Major Brent received the following orders from Major General Taylor. Major J. L. Brent will take supreme command of the two gunboats, the Queen of the West and the Webb, Captain Charles Pierce commanding. He will apply to Major W. M. Levi, commanding post at Fort DeRussy, for such aid and assistance as he may require to fit out the expedition in the shortest possible space of time, which aid will be rendered by Major Levi to the extent of his means. Major Brent admits that he was surprised to receive the order to take command, given that he had no experience with the Navy or Mississippi riverboats. By his rationale, Major General Taylor saw many qualities of leadership within him, despite his rank and the availability of officers senior to him. So he did not balk at the assignment. Once Major Brent deemed the vessels ready, he was to sail down the Red River and into the Mississippi in search of further Union vessels that ran the Vicksburg batteries. While still in Alexandria, he put out a call for volunteers to man the two vessels, and enough men answered to fill the crew requirements, save stokers for the steam engines. While at Fort DeRussy, Major Brent also took on detachments from the garrison commanded by Major Levi, which included the 3rd Maryland Field Artillery, the 21st Tennessee Infantry, the New Orleans Crescent City Heavy Artillery, and Burnett's 1st Texas Sharpshooters. As both vessels were steam-powered, they required stokers to keep the fires burning, and Major Brent refused to use the volunteers from Alexandria or Fort DeRussy for this task. He made several requests from the fort's commander, who had slaves from the local plantations strengthening the fortifications, but was on several occasions denied. It was only at this point that he relied on his appointment orders to get the stokers he desired. I then sat down at his table and wrote him that my expedition was ready to enter the Mississippi River and engage the enemy as ordered by General Taylor as soon as I had stokers, that there were large numbers of Negroes suitable for this work at his fort, and I asked him, first, to deliver me a suitable number of stokers. Second, failing this, to authorize me to seize and impress them with my own men. I further wrote that if he failed to comply with my request and to execute his orders from General Taylor to furnish me with every aid, I would suspend all of my movement and send a courier to General Taylor, informing him that the expedition was ready to sail, but was arrested for want of stokers, that Major Levi had them, but refused to either deliver to me or authorized me to seize them, and that my movements are paralyzed by his actions. Upon receipt of this letter, Major Levi agreed to provide enough slaves to serve as stokers for the expedition. The CSS Queen of the West and CSS Webb now had a total complement of sailors, troops, and slaves of 135, and on the morning of 22 February 1863, the expedition was underway. By this time, the USS Indianola had already ran the Vicksburg batteries, and by comparison, even Major Brent did not expect his ships to put up much of a fight. I doubt whether any commander ever had an expedition of poorer promise against a formidable and well-equipped enemy as the ironclad Indianola. The boats were feeble and ill-shaped for a naval fight. The Queen of the West was only effective as a ram, and this effectiveness was limited to a blunt wooden bow, and made nearly solid for only a foot. It was armed with a 30-pounder Parrott gun mounted upon the bow. He details smaller caliber weapons and cotton bale armor, and continues. The Webb was a towboat, used before the war to bring ships over the bar into the Mississippi River. The bow was long and sharp, but without any extra strength given to enable her to act as a ram. Upon her deck was mounted a 30-pound Navy gun. As the expedition sailed down the Red River and made stops to take on coal or wood for the steam engines, Major Brent received intelligence about the USS Indianola operating in the Mississippi River, that it had 2 barges with coal in tow, which meant the ironclad was slower than usual. The expedition took on 2 more ships, the CSS Batey and the CSS Grand Era, and as they sailed up the Mississippi River to Natchez, Major Brent also learned that the Indianola was steaming upriver toward Grant's army, still trying to cross the river and march upon Vicksburg. On the morning of 24 February 1863, while passing the town of Rodney, Mississippi, Major Brent calculated that his expedition could make 5 miles per hour upriver with the Queen of the West and the Webb, compared to the Indianola's reported 2-mile-per-hour pace. This meant that the expedition could easily overtake the Indianola by that afternoon. But given the 4 Dahlgren guns aboard the ironclad outclassed all 4 Confederate ships in terms of firepower, Major Brent decided to intercept the Union vessel at night. As the ships of the expedition spotted the USS Indianola upon the Mississippi River on the evening of 24 February, Major Brent situated himself in the pilot house of the Queen of the West, where he could communicate best with the entire expedition. My plan of battle was simply to ram the enemy and continue ramming him as long as our boats held together and floated. I did not have enough men to think of boarding, as we knew he carried a numerous crew, and hence our only resource was to undergo his fire and ram until the contest was decided. As Major Brent began his attack, he feared a trap by the U.S. Navy and made one slight modification as the Queen of the West bore down on the USS Indianola. Not an indication of movement or light was apparent upon the Indianola. As we drew near, her great guns remained, to my amazement, silent and her machinery at rest. I was so much impressed by this unexplainable quietude that the idea suggested itself that she might be protected by some infernal machine intended to explode when we struck her. And to test this belief, when about 100 yards distant, I directed Captain McCloskey to open fire with his artillery and sharpshooters, and to continue firing without pause. Though the ship remained suspiciously silent, it was arrayed to fight, as its primary armament faced downriver in the direction of the advancing Confederate vessels. The smoke of our fire was still heavy around our guns when we were upon her, but just a moment or two before we struck, her machinery started and rapidly backed her, so that instead of our blow being delivered aft of the coal barge upon the unprotected hull, we struck the coal barge almost amidships. Through the coal barge, and the great mass of coal, grinding and rending, pierced our bow, until, passing clear through, we struck the enemy's hull. The USS Indianola suffered damage to its iron plate armor, and the machinery that drove her side wheels were critically damaged, meaning her maneuverability was severely reduced. The CSS Queen of the West hit the USS Indianola with such force that the two ships remained lodged together. Though stuck, the Confederates swept the decks with artillery and rifle fire until the ship finally broke free. As we backed clear of the enemy, after stripping him of the protection of one of his coal barges, the swift Webb, running like a railway express, dashed past us, receiving and returning our cheers, and rushed at the enemy, discharging at 100 yards range her rifle and banded 32-pound gun. But then the Indianola woke up and fired the two 11-inch guns of her forward casement at the Webb. Each projectile weighed 166 pounds, and he continues, but even at that range, the aim was bad, and one gigantic projectile passed through the railing of the bow, and the other just ahead of her. The CSS Webb struck the USS Indianola on its port bow, but did little damage. She then maneuvered across the bow to the starboard side and collided with the other coal barge, which extended beyond the bow. The Webb deflected off the coal barge and steamed between it and the Indianola, and inadvertently cut the lines between the two vessels. Though the first coal barge served as an extra layer of protection against the charge of the Queen of the West, the commander of the Indianola already had a significant store of coal on board, but he also had these barges lashed to the side for extended travel upon the rivers of the region. With one split in two and the other cut away, the Indianola was now less burdened to take on the Confederate expedition. Of the two main vessels in the expedition, the Webb was smaller and lighter, and her captain decided to steam upriver to add its force to ram the Indianola. The Queen of the West, on the other hand, had the means to ram under her own power. The Queen made her turn rapidly, and with a heavy head of steam, rushed back to the attack, receiving the fire of the two guns which failed to touch us. This time, the Indianola backed, and we struck her upon the turn of her bow, which caused us to glance and come into a parallel position with her. We poured a continuous fire from our artillery and sharpshooters upon her decks, and received a scattering fire from her sharpshooters. The Queen of the West once again disengaged from the Indianola, and Major Brent recognized that the maneuverability of his foe was severely reduced. For a third time, he ordered his ship to ram the Indianola. We steamed down upon her as rapidly as possible, receiving in safety the badly aimed and ineffectual fire of her guns. As we approached, I saw that we would be able to strike her where I had always sought, just abaft, meaning behind, her wheelhouse. And he continues, as we backed away out from this third charge, the stern of the enemy turned by force of the blow, or the current, or design, so that we came almost under the two 9-inch guns of her rear casemate, which opened on us at so close a range that the heat of the discharge was very precipitable. The weight of each shot was 90 pounds, and he continues, one gun missed, and the other struck us transversely, entering on our left side, just in front and above our boilers, and crossing the gun deck, killing 2 men outright, and wounding 4 men, and bespattering our deck and even the pilot house with blood and pieces of human flesh. Just as the Queen of the West disengaged yet again, the Webb, now at full speed, rammed into the Indianola. Now crippled, the Union vessel crossed to the western bank, where the crew attempted to beach and abandon the vessel, but failed. The Queen of the West, though still operable, could not sustain a fourth collision with the Indianola. Major Brent ordered the Webb to prepare to ram a third time, when he received word that the crew of the Indianola wanted to surrender. As the Confederate vessels stood down, Major Brent took stock of the damages upon his own vessels. It was a most fortunate occurrence for us that neither the Webb nor the Queen was called upon again to ram the enemy. If the Webb had rammed a third time, she would have undoubtedly sunk, as her bow had been smashed in upon her second charge, though the fact of this was then unknown. And of the Queen, the chief engineer reported that the shock of another ramming and the horizontal pressure created by it would dislodge the block and cause the main shaft to fall down, producing wreckage of the machinery, if not the boat itself. Just as Major Brent prepared to board the Indianola and officially accept the surrender, he stepped on a dislodged bale of cotton armor and fell into the Mississippi River. Caught in the current, he desperately attempted to pull himself out of the water, and he finally grabbed hold of the side wheel of the Queen of the West until the crew of the Webb rescued him. Major Brent boarded the USS Indianola and accepted the surrender of the vessel from its commander, Lieutenant Brown. He reported that the Indianola was taking on water, and upon further inspection, even the propellers and boilers were inoperable. Unable to move under her own power, Major Brent ordered the ship towed to the Mississippi bank to keep it out of the reach of Grant's army. But in this attempt, the Indianola sank into the river. In 1864, Joseph Brent was promoted to Brigadier General in the Confederate Army and took command of a Louisiana cavalry brigade, but he never led them in battle. After the war, Joseph Brent spent 2 years as a politician in Louisiana before returning to Maryland to practice law. As for the Indianola, it was raised from the river by the Confederates, but would not see further service in the war. It was eventually sold for scrap. Thank you for listening to the 38th episode. The link to Major Brent's book is now available on the podcast website, firstpersoncivilwarpodcast.com. On Facebook, Instagram, X, and LinkedIn this week, you will find a picture of Joseph L. Brent sometime during the Civil War. I'd like to thank the audience of this podcast, whether you began listening when it launched on 10 January 2024, or even if this is your first episode. For almost an entire year, I've endeavored to find the stories of the men who fought in the Civil War and present them to you in an informative and hopefully entertaining manner, which also respects what each author saw as important to him. Through their words and my voice, I hope you've come to appreciate that the soldier's account of a battle is just as important as a general's. I look forward to another year providing first-person Civil War podcast to you, my amazing audience. If you've enjoyed the podcast, I ask that you subscribe on whatever platform you use and leave a review and share it with your friends. If you would like to support the podcast financially, please follow the link entitled Donate, located in the top menu bar of the website, right next to the social media icons. All transactions are secured through the Clover network. Any amount is welcome and greatly appreciated, and will go toward the expenses of the podcast. With that said, I have an announcement concerning episode production. My schedule in December is quite busy, and I've decided to publish my next episode on 8 January 2025. To celebrate 1 year of the podcast, I've decided to make the next episode on 8 January 2025 a special episode. Seaman James McGee and the crew of the USS Kearsarge face Captain Raphael Semmes, commander of the CSS Alabama, and they both provide next episode's first-person accounts at the Battle of Cherbourg. My name is Bill Coughlin, and thank you for listening to First Person Civil War Podcast.